Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for bearing with us. I want to try something first before we get started to kind of just like there's a lot of energy in the room, a lot of like different people, and this is kind of like a nice way that I've seen these things set up before. Something that I actually learned when I was in America this summer, and I attended some events led by Indigenous folks who are organising out there. But I think that this kind of will apply in any space. So if you're able to, if you mind standing up. Absolutely, yeah. Including the panel. Okay, thank you. Everyone, so if you have the space, I want us all to reach up really high. We're reaching up to our ancestors. We are reaching out to our ancestors. We are greeting our ancestors. We reach out to the sides, to our communities, to our neighbors. Reach out to the sides. And then down to the ground, we release to the earth. Because there is so much that is going to be held in this space, and we're not going to be able to hold all of it ourselves, but the earth carries us. And it's just something that I feel sometimes we need to release that pressure and to just have a little moment where we acknowledge where we've come from, who we have around us, and kind of where we are. So thank you for that. If you can sit down. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Kelsey. I'm going to sit down. I need to perform. I'm Kelsey. I'm part of CAPE, Community Action on Prison Expansion. I'll be your chair this evening, and I just want to kind of thank everyone for coming. This is CAPE has never done an event like this. Like, we run like workshops and sort of like little things that feel a lot smaller than this, and this is like a really amazing turnout. So thank you so much, everyone, for showing up tonight. I really want to thank our panel for coming. We have so much knowledge here, and so much experience on this panel with us today that I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and I'm going to turn it over to audience questions because I really want it to be a participatory session where we hear what your questions are on these topics, right? But for a little bit of context, we kind of thought that it was a really good time to be having this conversation and to be drawing together lots of these topics. At the moment, in the headlines, we're hearing all about gangs and violence and exclusion rates, and we're hearing about that stuff all the time, but for some reason the solutions that are being given to us are around like increased policing and building more prisons. And Boris re-announced this intention to build all these mega prisons around the UK. So sort of like in response to this hype of fear and all of this that we're hearing all the time, and it felt like maybe it's time to draw together some of these conversations around exclusions, crime and violence that is impacting youth, and these mega prisons that are being built, as well as like violence that's happening elsewhere, including in the home and in intimate partner relationships. So I wanted to bring all of those things together. A little note that this is a conversation that's going to hit on some pretty heavy and potentially sensitive topics. If we can all try to be respectful and look after each other and ourselves in the space. But yeah, I want to acknowledge that there's going to be people in the room who are impacted, have been impacted, and have people close to them who are impacted by a lot of these issues. So if we can be sensitive to that, that would be great. But now, I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves one by one, if that's all right. Zahra, if you'd like to start. Just sort of 5 minutes. I think it's less than.
So good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I think I've been duped because Kelsey said this was going to be an intimate little chat in our front room. But I'm really happy that you will come, and obviously it's a room full of people that on a Tuesday night want to talk about abolitionist futures, right? What's better than that? So my name is Zahra. I am a recovering teacher of 20 years, this secondary teacher. This year I celebrated actually my 20th year with a notice for redundancy. And I taught in East London, and I lived in East London. And now I live in Kilburn in my mum's flat because I had to sell my house as a result of the redundancy, right? So part of my teaching, quite a long part, majority of the time, I was in a pupil referral unit. Put your hands up if you know what that is. Do you know what a pupil referral unit is? What about those who don't know? Let me see. Oh, there's a few. So that's where children that have been excluded from mainstream education, that have been deemed to be unteachable, get sent, right? So I was in that environment for 11 years, and I never thought I'd last, to be honest, a week, ducking chairs, being called every name under the sun, and thinking, is this what my parents, wanted for my future? But I stayed 11 years, and I was really, really sad and heartbroken when I was made redundant last year. But coming out of that environment, I actually had the space to think about what it is I was doing. I remember my head teacher there saying to me, Zahra, if you can save, the word save was used, save one person, one young person, you've earned your salary for the year. Nice, right? And I kind of accepted that for quite a few years, thanks to my critical teacher training, etc. Program. So looking back now, how on earth did I ever accept that? How can you accept that? That you have on average, I don't know, we had about 60 children coming through the doors year after year, predominantly boys, predominantly black and Asian, all on free school meals, all labelled as SEND, whether or not they've got any special educational needs, that's neither here nor there. That label is stuck on their foreheads primarily for funding purposes, and it follows them wherever they go thereafter. Majority, by the way, don't go back to mainstream. And if they do go back, they bounce back because they can't cope, right? And I want to say I wouldn't cope either if I was them. So I'm in that environment, I'm thinking I'm doing something good, I'm saving my one student a year, I'm earning my salary, which, makes me sleep well at night. And then actually, with the redundancy and the timeout, the enforced timeout, I had time to reflect. And the other thing that happened that made me reflect as well was, one good thing that came from my employment before they got rid of us was some money to do a master's course at the IOE. And I have to say, sociology changed my life, right? So if anybody in here is thinking, what shall I read? Read sociology texts, right? So it made me think about the race, the class, the gender, the ableism, all those forces that define normalcy in education, and that I contributed to uphold, right? I was complicit. And so when I'm saying I am a recovering teacher, I actually mean it. And I wasn't just miseducated by one education system, not just the British, because I was born in Rome, and I came here at the age of 16. So there was a chance of, two education systems, two colonial, imperial education systems to miseducate me. And so please bear with me, yeah? Throughout the evening. I might leave it there, but as a result of that, there was a lot of anger, because on reflection, I realized that perhaps that wasn't the best use of my time as an educator. I learned a lot, and No More Exclusions came out of it. Sheer anger and frustration. And it is a movement that literally aims to do exactly that, to abolish exclusions. And I do get quite a few worried teachers come up to me, because I'm in the National Education Union, and I go a lot to educators event, and they go, Zahra, do you actually mean no more exclusion? I said, yeah, I do. And they go, what do you mean? What about the rapists? And I said, well, I've never met any in school, but if you have, please, let me know, because do you mean to say the exclusion would be the solution for that? It's like prison, isn't it? Anything that doesn't fit, let's just track them in prison out of sight, and that's the solution for everything that society can't deal with. But anyway, I'll leave it there, there's much more to say. Thank you.
hear me? Yeah. So I'm going to introduce CAPE rather than myself. So I organise with CAPE, and we are Community Action Against Prison Expansion. So we're like a grassroots organisation, and we're resisting the prison expansion in the UK. So as Kelsey sort of already mentioned, the government has announced a plan to build 6 new mega prisons across the UK. So we're trying to resist, and we try and support local groups in the areas in which these prisons are being built to help them understand the sort of negative impacts of these prisons in their communities. We also support a few groups in the States, and just try and build solidarity. And we're trying to shift the narrative around prisons and crime and harm in general. And we do this through events like this, which is our first one, and workshops, like Abolition 101 workshops. Yeah, we're trying to change the narrative. We're also currently working on a moratorium, like an open letter with abolitionist futures, which is going to demand that we have no more prisons and build no more prisons. It's actually at the back. If you're interested in reading it, you can speak to Nick over there or chat to Kelsey. We want to get all different groups on board to sign this open letter to demand that the government stops building new prisons because they're not keeping us safe, as we already know, as we're all here to discuss today. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Aviah, and I'm here from Sisters Uncut. I guess I'll just talk a little bit about Sisters and I guess a little bit my journey into Sisters and what we focus on. Sisters started as a feminist collective about 5 years ago. When we started, it was to focus on cuts to domestic violence services. So a group of us some of us were survivors, some of us were working in the domestic violence sector. 5 years ago, it was when the effects of austerity were starting to really be felt. And so a group basically started this group to take direct action against that, to try and prevent that from happening, to prevent the loss of services. And in particular, where we were noticing that it was, certain kinds of services were being lost first. So BME refugees, for instance, were the first to go in the cuts. And a lot of the people that were coming to Sisters came from, various different experiences of both domestic violence, sexual violence, state violence. I personally, the reason why I really wanted to organise around domestic violence specifically and gender violence specifically was because of my own experiences as a child. Growing up, I don't think I can name one woman in my community who I hadn't known or witnessed experiencing gendered violence. I was in a refuge at one point as a child, and probably the thing that most impacted the rest of my life, and the reason why I do what I do, is because my best friend's mum was murdered by her dad when I was 9 years old on my estate in East London. I'll say her name was Mandy Graham, and that was probably one of the most formative experiences of my life, and a lot of why I'm here now. So essentially, lots of people in Sisters will have lots of different reasons, stories like that or different from that, as to why they want to organise on this issue. So when we started coming together, we decided that to initially take action against the cuts. But over the last 5 years, things have really developed and changed. We've learned a lot. I think it's really important to remember that when people want to take action and take direct action about things that are impacting them, that they don't necessarily decide to read lots of books first. But they might start to take on that learning along the journey. So a few years later, it came to our attention that although we really wanted to try and win these services back or like prevent them from being closed down, we became really conscious of the fact that, you know, the relationship between these organisations that we were trying to save and the state was really complicated and difficult, especially since there's been a really big increase in the amount of funding from the police and the Home Office, for instance, and what kind of impact that has on survivors' lives. So, for instance, you know, if your local domestic violence service is funded by the police and you're a migrant survivor with no recourse to public funds, or you've got insecure immigration status, you know, that there's a really big conflict of interest in terms of the organisation that's meant to be there to support you may knowingly or unknowingly end up sharing your information to the police in order. And that could end up with you being deported, for instance, or arrested on immigration charges. So yeah, our kind of analysis around this has really developed, and you know, in terms of focusing not only on trying to ensure that there are domestic violence services locally for survivors, but also really challenging state violence as well. So I don't know whether you're going to ask me probably specifically about actions later, but yeah.
Do you want to give an example? We can.
Yeah.
What do sisters do?
Sisters do. So yeah, we just to give you an idea of what we like, how we operate. We are we organise not as men, but we have women, trans, intersex, cis, and non-binary people organising with us. And you know, a number of different actions we've come up with. So for instance, organising around state violence, we did an action at Holloway Prison. If you don't know much about Holloway Prison, it closed a couple of years ago in this big rush to basically apparently close prisons in order to turn them into luxury apartments, and obviously the women's prison in London went first. So it's a bit of a complicated thing in terms of we want prisons to close down, but unfortunately that prison wasn't closing down and then ending up with all of those women out of prison. They would just move to prisons all over the country. But we saw it as an opportunity to go into that empty space, occupy it, and demand that the trauma of that place be transformed into something that's really useful for the community. So for social housing and a women's building that would continue to support the women in the community and also be a testament to the trauma of the many, many, many women who have been incarcerated there and who had died there. So yeah, we occupied that space for a week. We won a partial victory with the support of like lots of other organisations in Holloway and lots of local activists in Holloway who are very much involved in trying to make sure that Holloway Prison was turned into something for the community. And yeah, Peabody Housing Association have like bought that land and are going to be turning it into sort of affordable housing, some of it, and a women's building. So yeah, sort of almost a victory. Unfortunately, we've found out that the women's building that they're consulting on with MOPAC, which is the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime, about what that women's building is going to be. So there's definitely got a lot of more organising to do to make sure that that space still is maintained as a women's building that's community led and not a criminal justice space, which it looks like, you know, a lot of us suspect they're going to be like moving towards. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing next.
Hi everyone, I'm Adam. I just want to thank Kate for organising and the invitation and for putting this all together and for the great tuck shop and all that, and for getting everyone down here. I feel like I should also mention that we're in this incredible space, this incredible Kurdish community centre, and that at this time in particular, we should be extending our solidarity to the Kurdish people and their movement, particularly since the state that we're trying to challenge is deeply implicated in the oppression of the Kurdish people at the moment, and the struggles that we're facing against the police and against prisons in this country is intimately connected with their struggles against and also I guess this is kind of relevant. I first found out about the Kurdish struggle through doing work against the police with the black community in Tottenham, because every single meeting the black community had in Tottenham to challenge the police was always held in Bruce Grove in the Kurdish Community Centre. And so there was a really great kind of material solidarity between the black community and the Kurdish community in that part of Tottenham. And it's always something that helped me to understand how important their struggle is and how much we can learn from their movement as well. So yeah, big up you guys. Okay, so I was going to talk about three kind of moral panics, or three kind of racial folk devils, which I think are shaping the landscape of policing at the moment in this country, which can maybe help us to better understand how we're going to resist it. And those three kind of racial folk devils, or black folk devils, I think, are gangs, terrorists, and child groomers. And I think that it's important for us to understand these kinds of folk devils, because the existence of this, this is all about we deserve to live in safe communities, right? And the way in which the state is trying to address the problem that they're calling gangs, terrorism, and child grooming isn't the way in which it's going to make our communities safe. So I'll start with gangs. As I'm sure you all, as I do, read the Evening Standard every day, which is a great pleasure. What could make the tube journey more pleasurable than reading the Evening Standard, right? So I'm sure you've seen the kind of images and the kind of moral panics we've seen, and Boris Johnson has talked about opening more prisons, and his Home Secretary Priti Patel has talked about striking terror into the hearts of criminals. And we've seen, I think perhaps in the most sinister way, we've seen this public health approach being proposed, first by Sajid Javid and then by Priti Patel. And this public health approach, I think, is sinister because it looks a lot more like prevents than it does anything to do with social or health of anyone in the general public. And for people who are unfamiliar with it, what it's effectively doing is it's making it a statutory duty, which means it's a legal obligation for social workers, healthcare professionals, people who work in schools and education, to identify young people who appear to be involved in or affected by gang violence. And if they are and that reporting has to be done to the police. So in a comparable way to similar people in statutory organisations who are obliged to report young people who appear to have signs of terrorist or radicalisation, we can think about the ways in which this kind of reporting is likely to be highly racialised. It's likely to be racist. And it's likely to be very, very elastic. So people interpret certain types of language, certain types of behaviour, certain types of injuries, all of these types of things as being involved in a gang. One of these, as probably garnered the most attention, is young people's creativity. So there's a kind of a subgenre of rap music called drill music, which the government and the police are trying to effectively criminalise completely at the moment. In the most extreme cases, we've had young people who haven't incited violence in any of their lyrics, so the police can't arrest them for inciting violence. But so what the police have done is they've gone to a judge and said, we believe these young people are involved in a gang, and therefore if they say any place, any name, or recall any event, then that should be interpreted as inciting violence. And so when these young people have then gone to a music festival and performed their music for lots of white middle class festival goers, they've been given a 2-year suspended sentence, which is unprecedented in modern Britain. No one has been given a custodial sentence for performing a music song in modern Britain. So it's really invasive, the ways in which this policing. It's not the normal kind of pick them up, plant some drugs on them, send them to jail. It's invading social life, educational life, cultural life. Every aspect of their lives are being surveilled, and this carceral logic is penetrating every section of it. We're seeing, I think, an interesting kind of resurgence of the language of prevents, and I think it's similarly sinister because we're seeing the language of prevent being used as a way of tackling the far right. We're saying, oh, the fastest growing referrals to prevent, and now the far right. And everyone says, oh, that's good, isn't it? The states are going to do something about the far right. And by your laughter, you already realise how dangerous that is, right? The fact that we have a far right prime minister basically saying the exact same thing as the far right, and we have a police service which is, close enough to fascistic. They're the ones who are dealing with our far right, apparently. I think, number one, helps to legitimise prevent as something which isn't racist, because look, we're going for the fascists too. Of course, for some reason, the fascists don't have their citizenship stripped and all the rest of it, and don't have secret prisons floating around the Gulf of Saudi Arabia and all the rest of it. But more importantly, I think it means that it is attempting to co-opt our own grassroots anti-fascist movements. It's an attempt to co-opt the kind of grassroots anti-fascist movements that we need to make a real change, to stop the rising tide of fascism that we're of course seeing in this country, and may even get worse depending on what the hell happens with Brexit. Sorry for mentioning Brexit. Okay, so the final one, and I think it's probably the most difficult one, is the topic of child grooming, which particularly has been, which I think is very much linked to the idea of gangs and very much linked to the far right, because we see the discourse of gangs, this time the Muslim gang rather than the knife-carrying gang, being used as the distinct group which carries out this type of crime, right? So it's something which is distinctly racialised. The victim is white, the perpetrator are groups of men of colour. Right? The second thing I think it does is it of course links to terrorism as well. So for some of these cases, this is the first time that for an offence like child sexual exploitation, we have seen people not only be imprisoned, not simply deported, but having their citizenship stripped.
We've got a bug, don't worry.
Cool. Can I just get through?
Yep.
And we've seen them have their citizenship stripped as well. And so, of course, in a comparable way to the way in which Prevent operates, what it does is it creates the impression that the state is there, the patriarchal state, the powerful state that knows how to deal with these kinds of men and more importantly, knows how to protect women, is the state which is able to do that. And what's also very concerning about it, of course, is that the far right, the grassroots of the far right, are trying to take that role as well. It's the grassroots of the far right, Britain First, UKIP and other organisations which are saying, we are the ones who are going to protect vulnerable women. No, still not. No. It's fine. It's fine. I'll just. We are the ones who are going to be doing that kind of work. And of course, it's either through the logic of the far right, it's fascism, where they do that kind of work, where they march on Muslim communities, where in some cases they kill innocent Muslim people. And of course, it's the logic of the state, where this leads to greater incarceration, greater levels of deportation, and in some extreme cases, the stripping of citizenship. And so in order for us to have a more, of course, abolitionist approach, which I'm sure Aviah and others are going to talk about, and others will talk about in the discussion, we need to be thinking about alternatives to this kind of punitive approach, the ways in which we can have preventative measures, the ways in which we can keep the most vulnerable women and girls safe from any kind of exploitation.
This one might be more annoying, it's so rattly.
Okay.
Can people hear at the back?
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. We'll just project much better, yeah.
And so whilst on the one hand it creates the impression that child exploitation is this alien invasion that has come to Britain. Britain was this, this sanctimonious place where everyone kind of got on with each other and there was no kind of sexual violence until Muslims or whichever racial group, whichever racial category has been attributed to this crime came in and started doing it to our women. On the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, it seeks to legitimise the prison system. It helps to legitimise the border regime. It helps to legitimise the ways in which the police and UK Border Force and all of these different agencies operate to criminalise entire communities in the name of some kind of warped state-led feminism. And so I think we're thinking about these three kind of racial folk devils the gangster, the terrorist, and the grooming gang. We can see the ways in which the state is attempting to tell us that it's trying to keep us safe from violence, trying to keep us safe from exploitation, trying to keep us safe, whilst at the very same time, of course, they're doing nothing but not only not keeping us safe, but it's imposing an even greater violence upon the most vulnerable communities that exist across the country.
Thank you so much, all of you. I guess my first question I'm going to give to Zahra, which is you mentioned exclusion rates, and I wondered if you could just give us a little bit more of a picture of sort of what the realities of exclusion and racism are within the education system. Yeah, and maybe if you want to talk about this plan for secure schools.
In the same.
Yeah, if you would like to maybe.
Can I ask the audience, how many of you work in education? Oh, excellent. I've got a lot of helpers. Okay, good. How many of you are happy in education? Not a single.
We don't
Yeah, what is
Don't count, don't count.
Happy, define happy, yeah. We could spend all evening. We could have a panel on that. Okay, but the happy lot are in the minority, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, we don't count with higher education, I don't think.
I'm used to being minority.
You're used to being a minority. Right, okay. So, exclusions. The question is, race, exclusion, the figures, what's the picture?
Yeah.
Right, okay. The truth is, the official stats claim that 42 young people get permanently excluded every day. The truth is, nobody knows really what the real figures are because of off-rolling. How many of you have heard of off-rolling? A report came out, I think it was Thursday or Friday, by the EPI. It was sponsored by our union, the NEU, called Unexplained Exits. Please look it up. Really good because it's groundbreaking. It's the first study of its kind that's trying to put a number on the size of the off-rolling scandal, which, by the way, is illegal. It's not just immoral, but it is completely legal. And talking about earlier, I was talking about how personally I was complicit as a teacher for the 20 years I worked in education. But then you've got to talk about the senior teachers that are complicit and off-roll the human unsaleable goods, yes, that can't be turned into grades that are going to make them look good and are going to, hit the right targets and push them up the league tables wherever they need to be. But worry not, because that human unsaleable educational failure can be commodified somewhere else. Right? Where, Kelsey? Where could that be? It's a bit of a mystery, isn't it? Right? What could we do with these primarily
Where do they go?
poor and and racialized and either misdiagnosed with a SEND or undiagnosed, right? So they've started just to use the word the scandal of exclusion, but really that is something that in racialized community, and there is not something as a black community, I actually don't like that expression, but I'm going to use it if I'm permitted. Amongst, people of color, it is nothing new. There is no way, right? You are a black person, a person of color, and you haven't been personally affected. You don't have someone close to you who's been affected by the things that we're talking about on this. There's just no way. It's not an abstract thing that as scholars we study and we read about and we write theses on. We actually live this on our skins. That is the bottom line of how deep, right? School exclusion, but also everything else has been mentioned on the panel, runs. And the race disparities, one of the things that struck me when I was looking at the statistics, and for example, black children are excluded 3 to 4 times the rate of white children, right? And somebody said, well, but it's, in a union meeting. The class fee race argument, which is so boring. Because those things cut across each other, so it's like, these are false enemies, we're having a non-argument. So, but it's because of austerity, surely, Zahra. We pump more money into the system, we're going to solve exclusions. Do you think that's the solution?
No.
Who thinks no? Who's saying no? Somebody tell me the reason why you think that. Please, can Mo, person at random, who knows nothing about funding, could you please tell us why throwing money at schools isn't going to solve racialized school exclusions?
It's not the lack of funding, it's how the funding is organized.
Could you explain, please?
So how funding
We're
is
going to teach you for too long.
puts emphasis on things like outcomes in the way that you're talking about, and takes attention away from social factors and systemic oppressions that communities and peoples are facing. So,
Sorry, Mo, could you stand up?
It was completely at random. We never knew Mo before.
Mo's been planted.
If anybody wants to watch her TED Talk on Funded Out, please do.
Yeah. Thanks, Mo.
thanks, No More Exclusions.
But you're the expert on this.
Not actually. So how funding is organised kind of follows how things are reported and monitored and what emphasis is being put on. And in the same way that Aviah was speaking about what attention is placed when funding comes through the criminal justice system, in the education system you have these educational league tables and so far so good. So if you increase the funding without changing what the money is for, you're just going to intensify the problem. What we need to do is have more money but also have less restrictions and more kind of integrated non-money spreadsheet database based things. We need to move away from databases and back towards relationships where you can listen to what's going on with the people, but also systemically about the oppressions that are happening and state violence, because state violence doesn't turn on the database, and that is not an accident. Yeah, because the funders give you the database, you focus on the database, and then you don't see the oppression.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really good. So money helps, but it's not everything, right? That's the moral. That's what I take from that, Mo. And going back to the scandal school exclusions, the way that the race disparity emerges from school exclusions can be seen from a very, very young age. So we've got children as young as 4. My daughter's 4, she's in reception. And there are children in our age group that we have seen that we get referrals for that have been excluded or at risk or have been identified as young as 4. So if you have a child of colour, please bear in mind that could be you, right? And these are the kind of fears and these are the kind of regimes that if you're a parent, you have to live under, yeah? And what does that do? What does the impact do? Talk about the word scandal. Nothing new to us. In 1971, someone called Bernard Cord, this is Black History Month, it's really important to talk about history. Bernard Cord wrote a 9-chapter little pamphlet called How the Education System Turned a black child Educationally Subnormal, something like that. That's a very long title. But look at Bernard Cord, 1971. And that's, I would say, is one of the seminal pieces of reading as an educator that I wish I had done in 1999 when I was doing teacher training. And I'm still I don't think I'll ever get over the fact that I only came across it in 2016. I'm very angry about that. Because how many young people have I damaged? How many young people have I missed? How many young people have I misdiagnosed, misassessed, or completely ignored, and so on, right? How much did I contribute to the statistics and to those trends? When you look at the race disparity in prisons, we have even a bigger problem here than in the US. We've got the highest incarceration rate in Europe, and not content with that, greater disparity than the US. Did you know that? No? That's silent. So I'm getting the people not aware of that. So that's something not to be proud of, yeah, apart from Brexit. And again, it's another thing that as an educator, I'm thinking, how am I contributing to that? So when people say to me, well, Zahra, what can I do? I'm just a teacher, I'm just a TA, I'm just an assistant head. And I do get phone calls, or when I'm speaking at events, I get people that have a quiet word of me and they go, do you know, Monday I've got a meeting, I'm going to have some difficult decisions, I'm going to have to exclude, and you don't have to. You don't have to. Where is it written that you have to follow policies that going to have a long-lasting effect? 61% of young people are excluded and end up in prison. 61%. So when you're making that decision to exclude, where it's permanently fixed term, doesn't matter, you're contributing to those statistics. So as educators, we really have to take a step back. And I'm sorry, we're all complicit when we say nothing. We keep our head down. We think, oh, just say nothing. They won't come for me. They will come for you eventually. Your job is not safe. Everybody thinks that this job security thing, I've got to keep my head down just to keep a job. Nobody's job is safe. Nobody. I'm sorry to say it. And that's just the state that we're living in, right? And there's positives to be taken from that, I think, because it makes us less invested, I hope. Now, I'll tell you who's really invested in all of this, talking about secure school. In July, how many of you heard about the announcement that the Oasis Academy Trust is going to take over the first secure school in Kent, Medway, which is famous for all the abuses that took place there? It's a Christian trust. Awesome. Did you hear about this announcement? Please, can you look this up? This is really alarming, right? Really alarming turn of events. Because one, we've got the biggest prison expansion program ever happening now. And this is what people like Kelsey, right? And Cape in general, and Tope are trying to, demonstrate and inform us and raise awareness about and get us mobilized. But they are moving into the age groups, right, that are younger and younger, because this secure school is going to house 12 to 17-year-olds. 12 to 17-year-olds. To me, that's a child prison. Is that a term that, we should be freely using, not secure school? And also, we should really be thinking about the values that underpin education and that underpin society in general. I never went into education to be a jailer. Yet, when I was at the Peru, that's exactly where I was. I was required to follow the students from the classroom to the toilet and back, lock the toilet behind them, check the toilet after they used it to make sure they hadn't graffitied it or destroyed it in any way. We were required to have lunch with them in the dining hall under CCTV. They were never allowed outside for fresh air. What does that remind you, that expression? Prison. At least in prison they get fresh air. In the Peru they don't. We definitely gave them a substandard curriculum, and the cost of a Peru place is 18,000 to 25,000 a year on average, which is 3 to 4 to 5 times what it costs to educate a young person in mainstream. And do you know how many young people in the Peru get 5 GCSEs, which is the benchmark? 1%. So we pay 4 or 5 times more to get way less. So it doesn't make economic sense, right? So economically it doesn't make sense. So why do we keep on excluding at increasingly higher rates? Anybody? Because the plans are for the academy movement, like Oasis, to now open AP, alternative provision free schools. Places like the Boxing Academy over in Hackney, for example, that's been hailed as being the ideal alternative provision. Because of course, anyone who doesn't like school wants to box. Clearly. Right? And I love boxing, but it feels like a little bit limiting and stereotypical to me. And then you hear about free schools like the one in Brent, the Michaela Free School, and how great the results have been, and the way forward is to academize, go for free schools, and basically use a free market principle, competition, not cooperation, right? That incentivize schools to apply zero tolerance, no excuses, more exclusions, high levels of mental health. Do you know what? I was in a school in Essex doing supply, and I love doing supply. It's like being a spy. I love it. And obviously they haven't Googled me. You know when anyway, that's another story. Like, Google your teachers, like, look what they do. So they said to me, could you go and sit in the zone? And do a supervision. Now the zone is the isolation room. I'm sure everybody's heard of the isolation booths campaign, and yes, no? You've heard about this? It's picking up speed, and it should. Although it's only one of the exclusionary practices that's taking place, and we should go for abolition of the whole damn thing. So anyway, they asked me to go and supervise in this zone, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. So I'll go in there, and I kid you not, it's from here to the wall, there's no windows, there's 4 tables, you're facing the wall, and you sit there all day. You eat your lunch there. Somebody brings it in there. And there's a book on the teacher's desk that tells you the offences they've committed. And it could be, and I'm not exaggerating now. I took pictures of everything. What somebody had shiny shoes, which obviously promotes upskirting. That's a talk about feminism being used, right? Being walked. So Shiny shoes or whatever can possibly promote upskirt in Catholic school. That's not going to be good. Then there was someone who had a number 1 haircut. Number 1 haircut. They had to sit in there 3 days until the haircut grew. And then, okay, that potentially could be a racialized measure. Another one was for kissing teeth.
That's ridiculous.
And the final one was racist abuse. I was really interested in the racist abuse one because I thought, well, it's really meaty. That's a meaty one compared to the other ones, right? And I really wanted to interrogate the racist abuser. But I was told by the person that brought me into the zone that not only are the students expected to sit there in absolute silence, teachers that supervise have to also sit in silence and not allowed to interact whatsoever with the students. Now I have to say to you, right, I lasted 6 minutes. I'm serious, right? And then I apologize to the students profusely. So I'm really sorry if I get anybody in trouble. And if they do come in, just say that, you know, it's my fault, whatever. But, you know, are you all right? What's your name? How you feel? You know, I really felt not only that it's, you know, it's not something that any human being should be asked to do, but I actually felt that violence at that moment was being perpetrated on me as an adult, as well as on the children, and on that sacred relationship, teacher-student, that has been absolutely destroyed by these values that we really have to challenge as a society. Because that's really what's underneath it all. I'm going to leave it there. I could go on all day. I could tell you so much. Don't send me to the zone if I'm not to listen.
Thank you so much. I'm sure lots of people have questions for you. Who to go to next? I mean, I think Aviah, if you could maybe, I think you hinted at it a little bit and we've touched on it, but maybe now's a good time to talk about how the criminal justice system links to gender-based violence and sort of like how it's actually been strengthened by some of these like so-called feminist narratives.
Yeah.
Yeah, throw a bit of upskirting in there, please.
Oh God. Okay.
Sorry, could you repeat the question and project? I don't think we've got
Just asking Aviah if she could talk a little bit about like how the criminal justice system has been sort of strengthened and bolstered by sort of these supposed feminist narratives and the agenda around like that's supposedly around gender-based violence, how that's actually sort of like bolstered the criminal justice system.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you want to try this and see?
Yeah. All right.
Look getting a little bit noisy out there. I think it's still. It's
All right.
still. It's just
Where's the instructions?
Is this one not working?
Very
So
gentle.
I don't
Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, this is working now. Oh, hello.
Hello. So the question was how the state utilises domestic violence to shore up the criminal justice system. Yeah, cool. So yeah, it's kind of interesting how we've come from a situation maybe 40 odd years ago where the reputation of the police was to arrest no one in case of domestic violence, and now they want to nick everyone. So how did we get to that situation in the last 40 or whatever years? I mean, there's an interesting relationship has developed over that period between the state and what you might call carceral feminists. Carceral feminism is a branch of feminism which wants to deal with these issues of domestic and sexual violence by essentially putting perpetrators in prison, by using the police and the courts and prison sentences as a way of removing the people that they think are the problem from the rest of society, in the hope that that will hold those perpetrators to account and eventually reduce violence against women. So that's their theory. And yeah, over the last sort of that period, they've developed a relationship with the state in order to do that. One of the things that's really interesting in the UK, and I'll talk a little bit about the US as well, is that the first domestic violence units, police units, that started in the mid-80s were in Tottenham and Brixton about a year after the riots. So it's kind of been theorised that a lot of the reason why that relationship started to develop between these castle feminists and...
No, we'll just give up. Just
Sorry, left you on a
Sorry.
cliffhanger. Part of the reason why this relationship developed between sort of castle feminists and the police at this point was the police themselves were facing a sort of crisis in legitimacy after the riots, and the castle feminists were also doing their own work in terms of trying to bring to the state new answers as to how like domestic violence was going to be dealt with. And the police kind of saw this as an opportunity in a way to be like, okay, well we can now criminalize. It's a bit more difficult now, with these uprisings in Brixton and in Tottenham. But what we can do is we can use these domestic violence like programs. We can use these domestic violence units to essentially criminalise people through the back door, right? And they got a lot of inspiration to do that from the United States, which is where a lot of the castle feminist initiatives and programs and ideas that we are operating on in the UK, where they've come from. One of the things that came in, I think, the early 90s, I think it was like sort of 1994, something like that, was the Violence Against Women Act in America, which sought to essentially bring in a load of measures to, arrest more perpetrators, so have things like mandatory arrest, so that, when the police turn up to a domestic violence situation, they don't have a choice to arrest. It's, not based on what maybe the survivor wants, they will just make that arrest anyway. Another thing that came out through that act was mandatory minimum sentencing. So, if a domestic violence case comes up to court and that person is convicted, the judge has to pass a particular, often quite lengthy sentence. And obviously, we know that this has impacted mostly like working class communities of colour the deepest. And this is something that not only, it's happening in the States, but it's also happening here. One of the things that I think is really important to remember is not only was this having an impact in terms of perpetrators of domestic violence, but the people that have been most impacted has actually been survivors who can be criminalised through these sort of initiatives like mandatory arrest policies. So I mentioned before that one of the big issues at the moment is domestic violence services being funded by the state, being funded by Home Office, police and that kind of thing, and what kind of impact that has on migrant survivors. Because if the police become involved in your life in a way that they wouldn't have done without that kind of investment, then it leaves you vulnerable in a new kind of way. So that happens with migrant survivors, but also for survivors who might have defended themselves against their perpetrator. So if there's evidence that the police see on the perpetrator, then she might be liable to being arrested herself. So that was, the kind of part of the reason and a big contributor to what is now the prison industrial complex in the States. And it's been a big influencer for a lot of the policies that we have over here too. Has anyone heard of the domestic violence bill, domestic violence and abuse bill? That's been long kind of sidelined by Brexit, but promises again and again and again to bring in all of the similar kind of criminal justice measures for domestic violence that were brought in the States sort of 25, 30 years ago. Despite the fact that, most domestic violence organisations have been, demanding things like more refuge spaces, more housing, more access to legal aid, all of those things in order to make survivors safer. These are the things that survivors themselves say that they want. Very few survivors actually want to use the criminal justice system as a way to deal with the violence in their lives. It's a very minimal amount of people, and yet the castle feminist response and the state response has been to say, we will bring in this bill that is almost entirely criminal justice focused. It has been, it probably will be coming into effect, even though Brexit kind of meant that no acts have really come into effect for the last 3 years. But when I think Kelsey and other people were talking about the plans Boris has to open these new mega prisons and things like that, what we're going to see is a lot of the stuff that's happened already in the States is that mandatory minimum sentencing, long sentencing, like shoring up police powers is going to be used to fill these prisons with people from our communities. We've already seen it happening in the States, and I think it's extremely important and crucial at this point, even though we've already seen a massive expansion of the criminal justice system in this country, to do everything we can within our power to prevent that from happening. We've seen the devastation it's done to communities in the States. We've already seen the devastation it's done when specifically violence against women is utilised to do that, and not only towards, you know, the men in our community, but also to the women and the survivors in our community and the devastation that that has reaped. There are survivors in the States who are serving sentences for years simply for defending themselves against perpetrators, and that is exactly what is going to end up happening in this country if we don't prevent it from happening.
So what we're touching on a lot is like these narratives of like crime and violence, but then also that these are given to us as solutions that are about our safety. And obviously what we're hearing is that these aren't really the things that are keeping us safe, right? And particularly the people who are actually most vulnerable to violence in all parts of their lives, whether that's within the education system, at home, on the street, at the hands of the state itself. Tope, do you have anything to sort of add about sort of like how we know with these new prison plans that like that, you know, that's being portrayed as a solution to all of this? Like, is there something else anything else that you want to add in terms of like how we know that building these prisons is really not about keeping anyone safe? Or not marginalised people anyway.
Yeah. So like, yeah, everyone sort of touched on it already. So in the last like 25 years or so, we've seen like the prison population has like doubled, and like as people have said already, we now have the largest population in Europe, and that's not including people in detention centres, which are prisons, and people in these like secure psychiatric hospitals, again, which are just different types of prisons. And I think what you were saying about if they build these prisons, they're going to fill them. Like our government spent about over $1 billion in total on these 6 new mega prisons and these secure schools, which are just children's prisons, and these like women's centres, which again are just prisons for women. So the government's not spending that much money to like, you know, have a few empty prisons. They're going to fill them up, and we're already seeing the Tories talking about being like really tough on crime and like cracking down on like knife crime and all of that. And we've seen like in the States, so Rikers Island in New York was initially built as like a new rehabilitative prison, and now it's one of the largest, most harmful prisons out. Like I'm sure we've all heard of Rikers, and people are dying in Rikers every single day. So we've seen it in the States that, you know, when they build these new prisons, eventually it ends up in the same old, you know, it's a prison still, and it's going to end up harming people and not actually keeping anybody safe. Yeah, and actually, we know that prisons are ineffective because in the UK we've got a reoffending rate of about 25%. So that means like a quarter of people who are leaving prison are reoffending within the year. So clearly something's
It's a lot higher than that. It's about 60%.
Well, that's in the first year.
Yeah, reoffending. The reoffending rate within the first year for a 12-month sentence is 60%.
Okay. I mean,
yeah, and the thing is I guess like also it depends on whether they're counting on whether it's the same crime and things like that as well, but like people ending up back in prison, these stats, like they're often very variable, but it's very hard.
Yeah, I mean ultimately we don't really know because not everyone's caught or whatever. That was a statistic that I heard the other day. I've lost my train of thought now. Yeah. Yeah, so we're already seeing you know, the government talking about being tough on crime and like you know, this domestic violence bill, which I don't know much about, but you know, we can see how they're going to start criminalising our communities. And I can't talk much of this because we don't really know what's going to happen. But what we are hearing is that they're going to use these new prisons as like cheap labour and just as a new way to exploit people, which clearly isn't about keeping anybody safe. It's about getting cheap like prison labour, and like sort of copying the American style mass incarceration, cheap, like getting paid like 10 pence a day to work these like stupid hours or whatever. So we're already seeing this happening. And I think if you get a copy of the Prison Islands Dean, it talks a bit more about these plans in general, labour in general. Yeah, and I think if we actually look at harm and trying to like unpack harm and like crime, we can see that prisons aren't keeping us safe, because we've talked about state violence and like domestic violence. People who actually sort of perpetuating harm aren't in prison. So, you know, 2 years ago with Grenfell, you know, people still haven't been housed. These people have had like masses of like state violence against them, but no one's been held accountable for that, you know? Who are we actually criminalising? And we can see that it's queer people, people of colour who are actually in prisons, people who aren't harming anybody in the sense, but their actions are being like sort of criminalised, and they're being put in these prisons, they're filling these prisons, and prisons sort of work to like maintain inequality rather than keep anybody safe. You know, it keeps like the ruling elite. Yeah, I wrote that, elitism. Yeah. Safe. Yeah. And you know, so I can't talk much about my work because not allowed really. But I work as like a through the gate worker, and what we see is like homeless people are more likely to be in prison, because what happens is they go to prison, they lose their houses, especially women lose their children when they go to prison, and they end up like reoffending, committing these what you call like survival crimes to end up back in prison again. And we can see that cycle, but like how prisons aren't keeping us safe, they're actually causing more harm. And I think if we actually look at this sort of logic of like how we're trying to keep people safe by putting them in a cage, it doesn't make sense. If we want people to understand harm and accountability in case of like sexual violence, if we want people to understand consent and all those sort of key things, how does putting them in a cage for like 23 hours a day actually work to keep anybody safe? And if we actually look at what keeps our communities safe, it's like these strong communities, and prisons are doing the exact opposite of what we need to keep each other safe, because it's isolating people from the communities. You know, people leave prisons and have to try and find housing again, have to try and get a job again, and they're sort of like disjointed from their community. You know, if you've been in prison for 10, 15 years, how much has society changed in the last 10, 15 years? You can't get a job anymore, you can't contribute to your communities anymore. So like they're sort of designed to isolate people and to stop people from like building these strong communities. That, as you can see on the event poster, you know, strong communities make sort of police and prisons obsolete. Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about, and if anyone wants to jump in on this, you know, it's clearly a massive waste of resources going into all of these things that are not actually improving our safety, are not creating like strong communities. We're also, I think you were touching on as well, that like the criminal justice system, it doesn't give you any incentive to be accountable for your actions. Like everything about the way that policing in prisons works is don't get caught, not don't do the thing. And that over and over, like particularly when I talk to teenagers about things like sexual violence, things like that, there's very much a narrative of like, if like this is what happens like if you get caught, and like people are looking for ways that they can do what they want without getting in trouble, rather than actually thinking about having compassionate mutual relationships with everyone. And I think it really speaks to the way that we normalize like manipulation and coercion in like everyday like interactions and within our relationships. And I think it speaks to just creating a way that we like outsource like like it's the police that you would call about this issue, so like we don't have to have the skills to actually address issues within our communities. So I wanted to ask, like, what are the kinds of things that we can be doing to improve safety in our communities, and what are the ways that we can create that incentive maybe to be accountable or to have accountability, and what would that look like? If anyone wants to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've spent quite a long time, or a lot of time, thinking about this. I mean, I think it needs to be thought of more broadly than just safety. Actually,
Sure.
I think in terms of when we think about accountability, and I think this is kind of a problem within our movements, is that, like, you know, in Sisters or in any activist space, is that, you know, when we think about accountability, we wait until something really bad's happened. We don't really think about accountability in terms of our daily life and like building a culture of like supported accountability where it's not so high stakes as we wait till an incident of sexual violence happens and then that we have this, you know, whole process that, you know, can be like very difficult and very high stakes.
And often accountability processes in activist circles become our own way of having a punitive structure.
Yeah.
Like something happens and then it's like you're going through an accountability process. Like, and it's like, here's the judge and jury for your accountability process. And it's, you know, so we kind of recreate a lot of that as well by doing that.
Actually, before stuff kind of, well, the great betrayal that's happened to the Kurdish people, I was actually have been in contact with, I've got friends there who have been telling me a lot about the Kurdish women's revolution and their approaches to accountability and I don't even really know if that's really the word that they would use, but how they approach problems and how they face things head on and don't wait for stuff to, I think, yeah, basically I've been in quite a lot of contact about learning about all these alternative ways of thinking about this stuff. I have a thing called Tech Mill, which maybe someone here can speak a little bit more about. It would be really great to like hear from them if they did want to speak a bit more about this, if anyone does know about that. Where, you know, they have sort of regular plenary meetings where people in the community come together and talk and encourage to self-critique and also critique each other in a loving and supportive way, and to provide space for that. And you know, I was kind of told that, you know, this is a huge part of what makes the revolution so strong there. And I was like, at first I was like, God, that sounds terrifying. But it's kind of made me reflect on like, well, you know, why do we deal with each other with so much like passag shit like all the time, and like writing post-it notes about shit we're pissed off about, and, you know, how is that healthy? How is that okay? Why doesn't that make me feel more uncomfortable in my daily life of like trying to address stuff in my community, in my family? Because if we're in a hopefully functional family relationship, then we can go to each other with this stuff, and we can trust each other to tell us stuff. So that's one thing that I think is really important, to broaden our understanding of this stuff, way outside of like just like, you know, physical and sexual harm, but just daily stuff. We need to like rethink this whole thing really about how we relate to each other in our communities. But there will be times when I think that people do need, you know, support around safety. And I think it's important to say, you know, I haven't always been a prison abolitionist, and I think that if anyone here is like, you know, thinking about their journey, thinking about the fact that, you know, they've had violence perpetrated against them, I don't want anyone to feel bad about the fact that maybe they needed to call the police at one point in their life, or, you know, feel some kind of way about their perpetrator, whatever. I don't want anyone to feel that way, because I wasn't always a prison abolitionist. And I think, you know, I'm on my own journey, and people, like, most people don't really have enough power within them to even get any kind of justice anyway, so it's okay to feel some kind of way about your perpetrator, you know? Sure. But I think, you know, starting to broaden out those, like, conversations about alternatives. For one thing, I think a lot of communities already have some of the alternatives to the criminal justice system in terms of dealing with problems that come up in their community. I often ask, you know, say, you know, if your cousin stole something from you, would you go to the police straight away? Most people probably wouldn't. How would you deal with it? Who would you go to? Who are the people in your community or your family or whatever that you go to when something happens, when something goes down? That's a really important part of how we think about safety, how we think about accountability. Also, just building from that, you know, different networks and connections where you can agree to be those people for each other, not just wait until something happens, but actually start building that community and building, you know, telephone numbers, who you're going to call if something happens at 3 a.m, who are the people that can do that, who is trained to do that, you know, or, you know, yeah, I think it's important to just do a lot of that fundamental work, building from the resources that you've already got within your community, kind of almost auditing, like, and looking at and mapping the spread of what's happening already, and how you can build on that, and how you can reinforce that, and how you can make it, like, grow stronger, essentially. I'm a big believer in kind of recognising the strength of people in the communities they're in now, rather than kind of coming in and saying, oh yeah, this is a whole new thing that you need to do. No, a lot of this stuff's already there. A lot of prison abolition is already in communities. A lot of people don't want to go to the police to shop their, like, friend, relative, neighbour, blah, blah, blah. So how are they dealing with it, and how can we build on that and support that and help it grow and make sure that people are safe?
I'd like to take some questions from the audience now. Let's open it up to the audience. Who's got a question for us? Don't be shy, put your hands up.
Maybe we covered everything.
One here.
I was wondering if some of you could, like, I'm not sure who, like, expand on the role of private companies in supporting, like, crime and justice policies in the UK and in prisons, and also in secure schools and harbors.
I can.
Do you want to
try? I mean, so with these sort of like new mega prisons that are being built, a lot of them are being sort of like contracted out to these private companies. So some of the actions that CAPE have done in the past is trying to target these companies, companies that are like profiting off mass incarceration. I think a lot of the time with this sort of narrative around abolition, we sort of get lost in the conversation about, you know, oh, the issue is private prisons, and they are an issue, but at the end of the day, like, a prison is not a prison if it's run by the state, it's run by private companies. But I think with private companies, so your question was how they're sort of involved, or?
Yeah, just like your take on it, basically.
Sorry. I can add a little bit, if that's right.
Yeah.
I guess just like what we might not realise is that like, so we think about private prisons being like often like an American problem, but like a higher proportion of our prisons in the UK are actually privately run, I believe. But also within our state prisons, it's all private contracts that. So even the new prisons that are being built that will be state-run technically are actually like privately contracted out in terms of the architects, the construction, the facilities management, the catering, and that's often like and the security, like all these kinds of things are often like private contracts even within like a state prison. So they're not. So it's not such a binary as we often think. And then there's also. The private so there's the private contracts in terms of like building and like running a prison. There's the private contracts in terms of like the like schemes and stuff that are run like for prisoners. So a lot of these rehabilitation schemes are often still like private companies that come in terms of like education or like skills based or whatever. And what I worry with the mega prisons is that post Brexit, as our like as our like economy. Like, I don't know anything about the economy, but I guess it's going to get worse. Something's going to happen. I've heard. I've just been saying we're careening towards Brexit, and basically I feel like a lot of the like sort of fallout is they're going to be trying to fill that in with like, hey, but guess what? Look at all this cheap labour you can exploit in these prisons, in these new prisons we've just built, where they're going to have these like. We've heard that it's going to be like 24/7.
It's for their redemption.
Yeah, oh yeah. And the prisoners should be really grateful for all the skills that they gain.
Of prison labour.
Yeah, and that like that it's doing prisoners somehow a favour to be like gaining skills within the prison system without questioning like why people didn't have access to jobs when they weren't in prison, or didn't have access to a university degree before they went to prison, or things like that. And it's all about like, oh, but you can put all of these like contracts into the prison system. There's even like, this was while I was away in the summer, and I was like messaging Kate being like, we have to do something about this. But like, it turns out Central St. Martin's has like a whole research center dedicated to like artists like building like prison furniture. And they get prisoners to like, there was like an exhibition of like prisoner, of like art students who've made like new furniture for prisons, where they're like, look at this really tiny multifunctional desk and toilet. And as if like just missing, as if like the reason that you couldn't do anything in your tiny cell was just because you happened to be in a tiny cell, not like that's entirely the point of putting you in that space. And so they were, you know, all this stuff, but it was people in Pentonville who made that furniture, and then it was displayed. Like the art students got to design it, and then it was like prisoners in Pentonville who made the furniture. And so like universities are also profiting off of prisons, you know what I mean? And like lots of different industries are actually profiting off of these prisons. It's also like, it's Sodexo who provides the catering in your university and within the prison system. Lots of these things are like very, very much connected.
Also, just to quickly interject, what I found out recently is if you refuse to work in prisons, you're actually punished. So it's not even like it's a choice where, you know, you can decide to be rehabilitated. Yeah. Like it's a part of being in prison. You have to do this sort of cheap labour for these companies which are profiting off your labour. Yeah,
there's no like choice in your job. There's no like sick days. The like working, you know, like the working conditions are obviously like completely coerced. And obviously like people are often like really bored in prison, right? And like it's not that like people don't want stuff to do when they're in a shit situation like that, but it's that the more we just invest in putting more of these things into prison rather than trying to get people out of prison, it just like makes the system like bigger and bigger and bigger. And what we're going to see potentially is these like 24/7 run like massive factory warehouses in these new mega prisons where they literally just do like 8-hour shifts and they just put people in, so they're working like 24/7. And that is like a scale that we have not, that is unprecedented so far in the UK, but like as far as we know, like that's sort of the plan. And they will groom children to get to that point, you know what I mean? Where within the secure school system, from PRUs to secure schools, they will end up in these prisons and they'll just be used to that environment, right? Institutionalized. No more questions. This one at the front.
So I just have a question. I think there's a lot of resources about kind of like theories about like surrounding this, but not many for people who are necessarily like survivors. And so I just have a question about, as we don't have the systems in place for kind of like a better form of justice or kind of like rehabilitation and actually solving these issues, what does somebody who's necessarily going through this, a survivor for example, do in a situation, for example, whether it's domestic violence or sexual violence, what is the kind of advice that you would give to kind of minimize, you know, the community damage, but also make sure that you're protecting the person who's affected?
Should we take a couple?
Yeah.
Take a couple and do that. Okay. Yeah. So I've got that one. Can we take one?
I think my question was.
Zahra.
Yes. Sorry, and Adam. It was around. So we know that policing isn't working for knife crime, and stop and search is ridiculous. So I was in a meeting earlier, and we were thinking up solutions, and I wanted to know your thoughts on mentoring and the investigation into expulsions and how to support such campaigns, basically, and is mentorship for young black boys a good solution?
Thank you. Can I take this question at the back?
I don't really have a question. I just want to promote something.
Okay.
Basically, I'm a youth worker in Whitechapel, and I work in quite a wide mainstream charity, and it's difficult in so many ways. They made the mistake of giving me access to some money. And so basically, I'm putting it on prepaid cards that I'm giving to young people to run their own projects around the area.
Amazing.
Nice. And so we meet every week and we work on their own projects to bring change, to organize events, to do that sort of stuff. So if any of you know of people, like young people, we're looking at kind of under 25-year-olds based in East London, who could use that support, access to resources, space, money. Yeah, come and see me, come and talk to me.
Thank you so much. Great. Thanks. Okay, we'll take this.
question makes sense. So I'm a psychologist and I work in people referral units and youth offending services. And I just wanted to ask what people's thoughts were about, you were talking before about kind of carceral, like kind of co-opting feminist narratives. And I wondered what people's thoughts were about co-opting mental health narratives in these communities. Because I think it's really, really dangerous at the moment how it's being weaponised. And I think that what we're seeing is a lot of young people showing really adaptive survival strategies in the oppressive system that they're working in, and then that being labelled. But at the same time, there's this big cry of like, it's time to talk and you need to reach out, and I just really appreciate your thoughts on that.
Great. Thank you so much. Great. So who wants to talk on
First question, what can survivors do now?
I can help. Please.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, if you're in danger and you feel like the thing you need to do at that moment is call the police, fair enough. I would never take that away from someone. I would never suggest that to someone. But you know what we've seen is in terms of like long-term safety is generally speaking, the police and prisons and courts don't really provide that to people. They might come and like take someone away for a little bit, but they probably won't provide that long-term safety that you need. So like, what can you do in that situation? Which is presumably what I know that like most survivors and all survivors want is just not to have violence in their life long term. That's what they really want. They don't necessarily want perpetrators to be carted off to prison. They just want the violence to end. Yeah, it's extremely difficult at the moment how to do that when you know we're in the economic situation that we're in. There's been huge cuts, but yeah, there are obviously some limited options still just about available in this dwindling welfare state that we've got left. You know, going to a refuge is a possibility. Moving, obviously, you know, that is an extremely difficult situation to be in, to feel like if you're in that much danger to have to leave, but it is still an option. Getting housing through your local authority or getting housing through another local authority is an option, usually if you have children or if you're considered a vulnerable adult. And yeah, I would say that trying to link in with community support services is really, really important. So if there's community domestic violence services, most places in London and to a lesser extent outside London do have those services available. So yeah, I would say to survivors, like, you know, link into those things. I'd say most survivors, are, you know, not necessarily looking for that criminal justice response, but if you do need that, then fair enough. But yeah, long term safety, I think there are like broader like sort of choices available, albeit limited.
I don't have much more to add to that, but we can share some resources online which talk about sort of what people in America are doing. There's Generation 5 that work with perpetrators of child sexual abuse, and then the No New Jails sort of document, and a couple of groups that are World Without Policing that sort of have options for when people are in situations of like domestic violence. And I think it's just sort of about finding people in your community who have the skills to sort of talk you through, you know, I think we want to know someone that either works in mental health or knows someone who works in mental health that can sort of talk you through things, or having like domestic violence helplines, things like that.
Yeah. And I think like trying to build capacity in our communities to support each other, so like working through like in terms of like people's immediate needs, right? Because what the criminal justice system does, even if it does cart someone off to prison, is it doesn't provide the healing that someone's going to need if they're experiencing violence. And so thinking about the ways that we can support each other and like making sure that someone's immediate needs are met. So being willing to like get people to go around and like actually take someone to your house to look up, do you know what I mean? Where it's like, if you can't stay here, we'll find somewhere else for you to stay. If you need to take time off work, like let's figure out how we can do that. Like if it's bargaining with someone's boss, or like supporting someone financially and raising money, or having funds within your community to do that kind of thing. Like things like bystander intervention training, so that we can like spot like things that are going on and know how to intervene without escalating, like building skills around de-escalation within our communities. These are all things that like we can start to do, but also be feeling out like because like actually like these are lots of these are things that like people around us do have skills in, but we don't necessarily like term it that. There's like so many mums who are actually really great at de-escalation because they have if you have like several children, at some point you're going to have had to de-escalate stuff. Things like that of like, what is it that works? Like, what are ways that we can intervene? And just because like the thing is that the frustration is often like, what we really want is for that thing to have not happened, and we can't undo an action, but what we can do is do our best to like make sure that people feel supported and find safety within our communities, like by whatever means that we can, if that makes sense.
Can I just quickly ask a question?
Yes.
In terms of, because it's an incident that's happened to me on occasion where I see young people get stopped by the police,
Yeah.
and I deliberately intervene.
Yeah.
How many of us here would intervene with regards to when we see incidents in our community?
Absolutely.
In terms of, do we actually actively get involved and question the police why they've stopped that young person?
Yeah.
Or if they hear violence or some woman screaming, how many of us in this room actually actively will intervene?
Yeah.
And that's the issue, because if you're talking about being proactive and you want to make some involvement in your community, it's all nice knowing all the figures and the data, but you have to be more proactive as a community.
Yeah.
And I don't think us as a community is actually that proactive. That's my honest opinion.
Totally. Thank you. And I think that is, like I was saying, in terms of like the way that we outsource a lot of these issues, where if we do just have cops and hotlines and things, then it makes us feel like we don't have the power to ever take things into our own hands, but actually like we can intervene, and we should be, and we should be learning our rights, and we should be thinking about the ways that we can do that.
London Campaign Against Police and State Violence provide training for how to intervene when you see someone being stopped and searched, and how you can support that person, what your rights are in that situation. What there's stopwatch, yeah. There's lots of organisations that you can look up that provide that training, and you know, once you've done that training, you can bring that training to your communities as well and try and spread that. Don't just like necessarily just turn up, but try and think of ways that you're going to spread that information and get more and more people in the know and feel confident that they're carrying things like information stop and search, like information leaflets that they can give to people, things like that. When they see someone in that kind of situation, I think you're absolutely right. Need to spread that as far as possible. Go to those trainings, spread those trainings. Yeah.
Can we move to the mentoring question, just because we're running out? Yeah.
I feel really bad because I think that person had a hand up. Yeah.
So it's just a kind of goes what you said about like intervening. But I think this is really where kind of like Alicia.
Can you stand up? We can't see you.
I agree with what you were saying about how people need to intervene, but I think being black, the ways that we intervene need to be smart, it needs to be safe, and a lot of times it isn't. For me, sometimes if I see a certain thing going on, the only thing that will stop me from intervening is also understanding that me as a black woman, I'm also now putting myself in danger, which is what I feel like right now there's a lot of white people in the room, love to see it, but I think what you said more goes to you guys here. You guys are in a different position than what I would be in to intervene in a situation. You're more listened to by the police, less likely to be arrested, they will take your concerns more seriously than mine, as a little black girl that's just obviously defending someone because we're all the same race. I think there's a danger there for me to do it where it's not present in you guys' lives, and I think that's what you guys need to stop at.
Alan, do you wanna? Did you wanna? I still do as well, but a lot of people are scared.
Yeah, sure, I appreciate that.
The thing on intervening I think is really, really important. I mean, my mum, I remember being in the car with my mum as a young boy, and my mum like pulling over the car because she's seen black people being stopped by the police, and we'll get out and be like, what are you doing? My mum was one of those fearless black people who's just like, do something. Like and she would just be like, what are you doing? And would take all their details, all of that kind of stuff. Back in like the early 90s, before people had smartphones recording, where she would just be going and just start cussing them, just to try to do something. But it's really, really important. I think that we do try to intervene as much as possible. And whenever I see someone being stopped and searched, I try as much as possible to record the police, but not them. And I tell the police officers, like, unless you can tell me, a member of the public, why it is you're stopping this young person. You know, I will be making a complaint about you as well, about this specific stop and search. And I think even the fact that when a police officer hears that the stop and search that they're carrying out, so, oh, it's this particular time, it's this particular place, this stop and search is clearly unlawful, I'm going to be making a complaint about it. At least it's something else that's going to clog up the system and hopefully stop when they do, if they do bring that young person into the custody suite, it makes that police officer think differently before holding them for that full 24 hours or trying to charge them for some trumped up bullshit, whatever it is they come up with. So I would strongly suggest a complaint about this clearly unlawful, even if it's not, you know, clearly unlawful. I mean, most of them are anyway, man. If anyone here has been stopped and searched, how often do the police officers say, hello, my name is this is the reason I'm stopping you, and these are your rights? No police officer ever says that when they stop and search you. Anyone who's been stopped and searched knows this, right? So basically every stop and search is unlawful, so just assume that it's unlawful and make the complaint. I shouldn't have put that on camera, I'll cut that.
Edit.
The thing about non-police solutions to knife crime, London Campaign Against Police and State Violence organised an event in this building actually, where we brainstormed we worked with people who were youth workers and teachers and worked in mental health and education and other sectors, where we brainstormed a lot of different non-police solutions to addressing, I hate the phrase knife crime because it doesn't, but problems of violence within our communities, and we've taken that workshop to schools and colleges in Hackney and other parts of London as well, where we're brainstorming with young people as well about the kind of preventative measures that we can take. So we've thought about the fact that a lot of young people who are affected by serious youth violence have been traumatised themselves and dealing with trauma, whether it be in the home or elsewhere, or they might have seen a friend of theirs experience violence, they might have experienced themselves in the streets. Similarly with mental health, so it's about linking up with the meagre mental health provision that exists to make sure that the young people who need it are able to access it. Similarly with the youth services, and the youth services that do exist, we need to make sure that these youth services don't become extensions of the police, which is what a lot of funding tries to make it at the moment. And instead making it places for young people to be safe, to articulate themselves, to talk about, like what the woman was mentioned earlier in East London, to be able to have youth-led projects to talk about their own concerns. And also the other thing we mentioned before, which is police monitoring, and making sure that we're monitoring the police and ensuring that the police are being policed. Because that's another enormous problem as well that exists. In terms of mentorship, I think the mentorship, I have a love-hate relationship with mentorship because I've been involved in a lot of black boy mentoring projects that were the worst things in the world. They were big, macho, patriarchal, sponsored by Barclays, hosted by Boris Johnson in City Hall. You know them kind of things where it's just like, man, you black men need to sort yourselves out. Here's £5, go and put yourselves in a room and sort your, do you know what I mean? And so it creates this impression that the violence that is experienced by black men is something which is somehow inherent in them, and it needs to be mentored out of them. And so there's a lot of problems with a lot of the mentorship projects because they can invisibilise the structural violence that is the root of the violence that black men experience. But whilst at the same time, as human beings, we are social animals and we all need mentorship, right? No human being on this planet, whether it's a parent or an older person or a friend or anything, we all need mentorship in our lives in order to learn, in order to grow, in order to have healthy relationships. And so mentorship is absolutely fundamentally important, but it has to be community-led. And the way that it's co-opted by the Conservative government, by every corporate social responsibility hack that is gentrifying our communities, that set up an office there and is doing a little mentorship for the youth to try to create the impression they're progressive. All of this kind of stuff means that I have a real love-hate relationship with mentorship, and I think, it's something that I do myself, but it's something that I talk about as little as possible because I know it can so easily be co-opted and create the impression that the problem with black boys is something in our head, right?
Thank you. Respond to this last question.
So you were talking about co-opting the mental health.
Yeah.
Do you mean the SCMH label?
I suppose what I'm talking about is the fact that in the same way as SCMH is very, very sticky as a label, so is mental health.
Does everybody know what SCMH is?
No.
Well, you should know. Social, emotional, mental health
needs. And I suppose what I was questioning about is, in a way, mental health is really like, it's a topic that everyone wants to talk about at the moment, but it's very difficult to make that conversation meaningful. And my concern is that, you know, instead of a lot of the behaviours that a lot of the young people that I work with in PRUs and youth offending services, you know, which people would call like aggressive behaviours or kind of antisocial behaviours, are actually they're adaptive coping mechanisms in response to significant amounts of trauma, not just trauma inflicted interpersonally, but also on a state level. Correct. And I think what's really worrying is it is good that people are being told that they should talk about their mental health, but who are you going to talk to and what are you going to talk about? And who is going to have that blame laid at their feet? And I suppose in a way, in the same way that you were talking about not wanting to putting the mentorship idea inside of someone, my worry is that that's what's been happening about mental health. That someone's being told that there is something wrong with them, instead of being asked what has happened to you, what have you lived through. And I suppose I'd just be really interested to know, kind of like you're saying, it is just about the labelling, but it's also about where you locate that problem. And instead of seeing it as survival, seeing it as something kind of a pathology or something.
Right, that's one of the things I'm really angry about. really, really angry about this system, because I sat in those PRU lessons, classrooms, right, for years, 11 years, with young people that had been labelled as having SCMH, for example, right? Which is, by the way, Oxford study published last year has recognised that it's a label that is disproportionately given to black children, but Oxford doesn't know why. So if anybody would like to help Oxford, help them to figure out why that particular label, right? Okay. So, and imagine if Oxford doesn't know, right? Well, you know, what's the hope we've got?
Possibly.
Yeah, with institutional racism and in general race equality. I'm sorry, I'm going slightly off, but I'm coming back to it. Because to me, race has been disabled and disability has been racialized for as long as, right? For a very long time. And there are studies. We've got, in this country, we've got at least 30 years of research. If you use CORD, you've got 50 years. If you look what goes on in... Actually, let me give you a little quiz. Apart from the UK, apart from this country, actually, let me not insult the UK. England is the kinkiest of the four, right? When it comes to punishment. You know this. If you know your history, you know this. It's true.
Scotland's bad, but England
come on, nowhere near. In 2016-17, whilst in England we had 7,720 exclusions, Scotland had
3.
5. That's really good, Adam. 5.
That's not the panel you
Go
You cheated. There are 3 other countries that exclude apart from England at a similar rate. They've got a similar structure. Can you guess what these other countries might be? This is going from history to geography now. So, apart from England, and the US, well done. 2 more to go.
Australia and New Zealand.
Australia, yes. New Zealand, no. And you've used all your life chances. Anyone else?
South Africa.
Well done. What do South Africa, Australia, England, and the US have in common?
The white settler colonies.
Right, okay.
And England.
Right, racialized